Yeah, we should do a show.
Okay, the show has started. All right, welcome to Ideas at Work and Beyond. What can I say? We have with us Giancarlo Perosuti. He is the former aide to two presidents of the United States. One is the former President Bush Sr., and actually the current one. So I am so pleased to have you joining us on Ideas at Work and Beyond to talk about your experience and also your new job, which we're going to talk about later on. Okay, welcome, sir.
Thanks, Ivan. Glad to be here.
Okay. Let me ask you the first question. What is it like to work for two presidents?
Well, they're both unique individuals, obviously, and in both instances it was an honor and a privilege, and I mean that sincerely. Working for the current president, the current administration, anytime someone has the opportunity to do that, it's obviously a unique privilege. To serve your country in that capacity, to have the opportunity to work in the White House, is an honor that I will never forget and forever be grateful having had that opportunity. And working for the former president in a different capacity, I worked for him after he had left office when he was a former president. And he's a man that I always admired before I ever got to know him. And once I did get to know him, having worked for him for 4 years, I know of no better human being on the planet Earth, certainly none that I've ever met.
Barbara.
As an individual.
His wife. She's a better human being.
Well, they're both wonderful people, but so when you ask me what it was like, it was an experience beyond measure for a variety of reasons.
Okay.
I like Barbara Bush.
Me too.
Great.
Now, let me ask you this. How much time did former President Bush give to Bill Clinton in terms of advising him about some of the policies that took place during his administration? Did they interact that much?
The answer is no, not when I worked for him. I was with former President Bush from January of 1997 until his son was elected in November of 2000, so just 2 months short of 4 years. And during that period, the relationship between former President Bush and Bill Clinton didn't enjoy the renaissance that they have had of late.
Yes.
And so...
Didn't they get together for tsunami relief,
That's
I
exactly
believe?
right.
That was the big catalyst.
Yeah, that was the catalyst,
Okay.
the event that brought them together. So during my time with the former president, Ivan, I can't tell you that they did a lot of communicating. They did speak on occasion. President Clinton was actually very courteous, and any time there was a major issue involving foreign policy, because he knew of former President Bush's interest in foreign policy, and especially in intelligence activities, having been the director of the CIA. Former President Bush would always get a courtesy call from the administration to let him know of events as they were unfolding, which he always appreciated. But in terms of a personal rapport, when I was with President Bush, he and Bill Clinton did not enjoy the relationship that they have today.
Wow.
Giancarlo, was this a low-paying job, a high-paying job? Was it more like just a tremendous experience?
It was the latter. I certainly didn't enter into it to get rich. And as a matter of fact, I was told when I got the job by the person who put me in touch with the former president in his office. He said to me, "This could be the greatest job you've ever had, but you ain't going to get rich doing it."
Yeah.
And he didn't lie on either front. So.
Well, I'm fascinated by the former President Bush. Now, you fill it out. You fill in the exact chronology of his resume. Youngest naval aviator in World War II.
Correct.
Shot down in the Pacific.
Yes.
I don't know how many medals he got. After that, he comes home to Greenwich, Connecticut, gets a haircut, marries Barbara from Rye, New York.
They were actually married prior to his going to the military.
Okay, then I corrected it. He graduated, did he graduate from Yale, come home, get a haircut, marry Barbara, and then go off to fight the Japanese in the Pacific? Okay, you fill in I've got it all wrong, so you fill it in. But it's an incredible story.
They had a secret engagement, quote unquote, while he went away to into the military. They were married. He came home from World War II. Incidentally, just a quick little story. He was shot down over the Pacific. And
rescued by a submarine?
Correct.
Okay, I got that.
Only a couple miles away from an island where, had he been washed up, the Japanese commander who ruled that island was subsequently brought up on war crimes for cannibalism.
Oh,
wow.
For eating U.S. fighter pilots who washed up on his shores. That is a true story.
Oh, my God.
And as President Bush tells the story, he was a rather skinny guy when he was in the Navy. He said, had I been washed up, I only would have been an hors d'oeuvre for this guy. It's one of his great lines, but it's a true story. Chichijima is the name of the island. But in any event, came back from the military. I hadn't heard got a haircut. I'm
well,
sure.
I got the reason there was an elderly barber on Greenwich Avenue in Greenwich that would cut my hair, and he would tell this story.
Wow.
But go ahead.
Well, anyway, went to Yale.
Right. Okay.
And Mrs. Bush, Barbara Bush, gave birth to our current president while they were living at Yale.
Now that was a big mistake.
and when they got married, there you go.
You mean he was illegitimate?
No. After
George W. is an illegitimate child of Barbara
Public
George
television
Bush?
here. We need to make sure that we get our facts right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
After they were married and after the current president was born, they got into his Studebaker upon his graduation and drove west to Texas so he could make his way in the oil business, which he did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Lived in Midland, Texas, was their first.
But he was the youngest naval aviator in World War II.
That's right.
Wow.
He enlisted the day he graduated from high school.
Wow.
Well, but it's embarrassing how close the Bushes are to big oil. And I'm embarrassed when I have to go to the gas pump and pay $2.99 a gallon. But Barbara Bush, she's a great lady.
There you go.
Well, no, you can't let this stuff go unchecked.
Oh.
Is it George Bush Sr. and Jr.'s fault that we're paying $2.99 a gallon for gas?
Oh, it's
or
not
is
their
there
fault.
more to it than Lynn is saying?
Look,
But they're very much into big oil.
well, I don't really know what that means. I mean, do they both have ties to oil? Well, certainly.
Friends in Saudi Arabia.
They have friends all over the world. When you become president of the United
Exactly.
States, and your
If
father
I had
was a U.S. senator, you'd know a lot of people in a lot of industries.
director of the CIA, if I had that power, who knows what I would do? But anyways.
There's an interesting story about the current, well, I don't know, you don't want to get into too much sort of a psychoanalysis or something like that, but there's an interesting story about the current George Bush, just on a human level, his politics aside. But, and you can fill me in, because I probably got this story wrong too, so it's good you're here.
Does it involve a haircut?
Doesn't involve a haircut, so no haircuts involved. But as a young child, George Bush had a sister who died of leukemia. And Barbara Bush suffered from depression for years and years. And George Bush, the current president, was very much her favorite and very in tune with Barbara Bush's mood and her whatever condition she found her. And there was a story where he was a young child, maybe 10 or 11, and the other kids on the block said, come on, let's go out and play. And he said, no, I can't go out and play. My mom is having a bad day, and I got to go home to my mom. So he was very much, his personality from a very young age was very much, let's keep everyone up. Let's depression or too much introspection is not necessarily good. Let's keep it up and light and do it. And you can kind of see that in the man, the President Bush, in the same way. Not given to deep reflection, good or bad. And there's a counter story too with President Clinton, who really grew up in a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic. And he was always very in tune with what is the mood of the room, what is the mood of my father, and how can I deal with that, and very good skills for a politician. Ditto Ronald Reagan. Anyways, but I don't mean to psychoanalyze, but I always thought that was very interesting for George Bush. Now, how did I get that story wrong?
You didn't get it wrong at all. That's actually, that's a true story, and I've heard both former President Bush and Mrs. Barbara Bush tell that story.
Is that right?
I think she writes about it in her book and mentions how it was really one of the to use a colloquialism, sort of a wake-up call for her, that children react and watch the actions of their parents. And she knew when she heard her eldest child say to his friends, exactly as you put it, Marty, I can't go out to play, essentially my mom needs me, that that she had to, I don't want to say watch her behavior, because obviously she was grieving, rightly so. And just as a coda to that story, you're correct that the Bush's daughter Robin died of leukemia, and they will tell you today that had that same child been born in this day and age, she probably would have survived. Wow. And so they have a deep commitment and a passion for fighting cancer. As a matter of fact, former President Bush was chairman of the board for many years of the MD Anderson, recently, of the MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is ranked right up there with Sloan Kettering in New York City as the best cancer hospital, if not in the world, certainly in the United States. And they spend a lot of their time and effort on behalf of fighting that disease.
Now, what is the relationship between the two, the current president and his father? Do you think that he calls his father for advice and on certain policies, etc.?
I didn't work for the former president when his son was president. I literally left my employment with the former President Bush the day after the election in 2000, when no one knew who the next president of the United States was going to be. But I still keep in close touch with the family and with my colleagues, former colleagues in that office, and I will tell you that the current president calls his father quite a bit. They don't discuss policy or politics quite a bit, and that their relationship is very much a father-son relationship, that a son will call to check in on his father, and President Bush will tell you this. I've heard him say it. He said it to me. I've heard him say it in public, that really he's just concerned about his son as his son, not for his son as President of the United States. Now, obviously the two are intertwined, but you know, he uses the Little League analogy. He said, you know, every time I pick up the paper and read something nasty about my son, he said, I think back to when George was playing Little League, and you know, maybe the ump made a bad call and unfairly, you know, called the third strike or whatever, and you kind of were exasperated and frustrated as a father sitting back on the sidelines knowing there was nothing you can do. He said it's amazing how similar it is when, you know, Michael Isikoff or Howard Feynman or Thomas Friedman takes a whack at his son in the press. He kind of feels the same way, and so they do talk frequently, but it's rarely, if at all, about policy and politics and what could be done or what couldn't be done, and more just as a father would, you know, chat with his son and want to give him a pep talk and keep his spirits high.
Another question I have for you is this: what exactly does a president do after they serve their 4 terms?
Great question. And the model differs somewhat based on, if you look back at former presidents who have had active lives as former presidents, there's no real model. There's been a lot of talk about sort of codifying the position as a former president, having some sort of a council that former presidents would sit on to lend their advice. And former President Bush used to get that question all the time. He's not in favor, not to put words in his mouth, but I've heard him say he's not necessarily in favor of that idea. And every president sort of charts their own path, and it's a combination of frankly, earning money on the speaking circuit. And every former president, certainly that's still alive, well, I guess former President Ford just died, but I know he did it. I believe former President Reagan did it as well. President Clinton does it. Former President Bush does it. I'm not entirely sure about President Carter, but you know, it's a way for them to earn money. They obviously get paid hefty fees by private entities to speak. I
remember Barbara Bush said she wrote a book about either a children's book or a book about a dog. It was Millie or something like that. But when she was touting her book, she said, "Well, this is after he lost to Bill Clinton." He said, "Well, my husband has shown an inability to hold down a job, so I figured I had to write this book to help the family finances."
That's right.
You know,
so that's one. But also, and Marty, you alluded to this, or didn't allude to it. You mentioned it earlier. You know, former presidents have an obligation, and they have fulfilled it, to do good charitable works. And you've seen that in President Clinton and President Bush's joint initiative on Katrina. When I worked, and Jimmy Carter as well, absolutely, who really devoted most of his post-presidency to doing that. And former President Bush, I know, feels extraordinarily strongly about doing that, and he raised probably in the neighborhood of hundreds of millions of dollars for charity in one way or the other. By donating and dedicating his time. We mentioned cancer, Mrs. Barbara Bush with literacy. I mean, they have done a lot. And then the third component, obviously, is politics. And they stay involved in politics, and they help when they can, raising money for candidates.
Making appearances.
Making appearances, that's exactly right. So it's really a combination of those three things. Speaking for profit, charitable works, and political activity.
No, I have said 4 terms. I mean to say 2 terms.
We knew what you meant.
4 years, 2 terms.
I have some questions, and this whole line of questioning is not substantive.
Before you ask that question, can I take the call?
Oh, yeah, by all
Okay,
means.
sure. Okay, thank you. Caller, you're on the air.
Excuse me?
Yes, caller, you're on the air.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
John Carlo, hey, Steve Ballman, how are you?
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing great. I was watching you. You look great, by the way.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
He's got a little 5
The
o'clock
question I had for you was with respect to when you worked for President Bush. Did you ever talk about policy decisions that he made during his presidency? And in particular, did you ever talk about the decision for him to select Dan Quayle as his vice president, and whether he ever regretted that or whether that was a drag on his presidency?
Great question, Steve. Thanks. The answer to the first part of the question is yes, but very, very rarely. You know, part of my job when I worked for
You didn't
President
go
Bush
to.
was,
What were you thinking
No.
with Quayle?
Yeah.
That never came up over tuna fish salad
doesn't-
and lunch?
Exactly. He doesn't naturally kind of flow to that line of questioning. And so when he and I were alone, you know, it was all about telling jokes and trying to keep him relaxed and happy because we were on, you know, day 3 of an 8-day foreign trip or whatever. And the last thing he wanted was, you know, some young loudmouth asking him questions about trying to second guess what he did when he was president. But so no, Steve, I never did ask him anything about Dan Quayle. I did ask him one substantive question about, you know, about his economic policy and, you know, how he felt about no new taxes, and obviously he famously exactly read my lips, went back on that pledge. But that was about it. And I think based on the answer he gave me, it was pretty clear that I keep the knock-knock jokes alive, and you know.
So no golf with Dan Quayle, huh?
No gossip on Dan Quayle, Steve. I'm sorry.
Hey, we'll see you around town, buddy.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Go ahead.
My neighbor.
All right. This is cable access. You know. My question, and I know it isn't terribly substantive, but what was it? What's it like to be in the White House? What's it like that you've flown on Air Force One?
I have.
What I mean, what's your impression of that? You know, like in Sports Illustrated, they say, "What was your welcome to the NFL experience?" Right. What was your welcome to the White House?
Well, I'll tell you, and you know, I hope I don't offend anyone by saying this, Marty. I know you're a religious guy. I'm a religious guy, but it is a religious experience. And I will tell you that the first time I stuck my head into the Oval Office, and I remember the first time I walked into the Oval Office, you have that feeling when your knees go weak and you feel an awesome aura about you in the true sense of the word. And, you know, it's not about any one person. I mean, and that's what makes it so great. And I will tell you, regardless of your opinion of our current president or of his father, that's the attitude that they take. They know the presidency is not about them, that they are only a person, a man, fallible human being filling that role for the time being. And so, you know, it would be that moment. Surely, you know, when I rode on Air Force one time, that was a unique experience also. I have a funny little story about that. But the answer to your question is, you know, just being in that building, you get this sense, similar sense for me anyway, of, you know, walking into St. Peter's or being anywhere where you know that there's a great sense of history and reverence that's, you know, that's been there for a long time. So,
what's the story?
All right, very quickly. So, first trip on it, my first and only trip on Air Force One was right after September 11th. Part of my role in the White House was handling relationships that the White House had with various industry groups and associations, and one of them was the transportation industry and the airline industry, which, as we all know, took a beating after September the 11th. And we wanted to do something to help prop that industry up. And so the president and his team came up with the great idea of flying to O'Hare Airport and essentially doing a rally, giving a speech and doing a rally for the airline industry. We had 10,000 employees from all the major U.S. airlines. It was at an outside hangar at O'Hare, and they had parked a United Airlines flight and an American Airlines plane, rather, tail to tail, so sort of formed a V, and they had everyone seated there, and the president gave a speech, and it was a great day. It was a beautiful day. The president gave a speech to rally that industry and encourage Americans to take to the skies again. Well, while we were flying out to the event, I'd gone out with the advance team the week before to make all the arrangements on a separate plane, and then we flew out before on Air Force One. I'm sitting there, and there's you're in the cabin with the rest of the staff, and most of the staff that were there were senior staffers, of which I was not one. So they had done this before.
So this wasn't like, God, can you believe what?
That's exactly right. I was like that, but I knew I had to keep it cool because everyone everyone that I was with was had done this before. So we're taxiing on the runway, and as I think you probably all know, when you're seated, you're at your desk, you're in a meeting, and the President of the United States walks in, the first thing you do is what? You stand up. So we're on the active runway, and I've got my seatbelt on. I'm sitting there, I have a glass of water in my lap, and the president comes through the cabin. So naturally, my first instinct is to stand up, forgetting that I have a seatbelt on. I get about halfway up, the water goes flying. Everyone stays in their seat and looks at me. The president kind of looks at me, chuckles, keeps walking. I sit back down, and the guy sitting next to me goes, "You don't have to stand up for the president on an active runway." Okay, thanks, I learned my lesson.
Good to know, good to know. That's funny.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. You traveled to 35 countries with the president.
With the former president.
The former president. Yeah. How was that experience?
Amazing, in a lot of unique ways. I had the chance to do some pretty cool things and see some pretty cool things when I traveled with him. I remember one trip in particular to Moscow. Typically, when former President Bush would travel to a foreign country, he would get an invitation from the leadership, the head of state of that country, to have a visit. And when we went to Russia, that was the case. And then President Boris Yeltsin invited us to what is the White House. They call it the White House in Russia, which is the president's quarters. And we actually had a 2-hour lunch in Yeltsin's private dining room. And it was Boris Yeltsin, President Bush, a translator, his chief of staff, and me.
For 2 hours.
For 2 hours, yeah. I mean, talk about being out of your league, right? So I was just, kind of sitting there, ate what was put in front of me, and kept my mouth shut and tried not to spill anything. And so I had,
What did they talk about?
Well, they talked about everything. I mean, U.S. politics, Russian politics.
Can you believe we ended the Cold War?
No, I mean, it was more current events. It was more prospective rather than retrospective, the conversation. But that was one.
And was the food good?
If you like Russian food, Lynn, sure. To be honest with you, I don't remember. If it was put in front of me, I ate it. We had several opportunities to sort of be a fly on the wall in those kinds of meetings in foreign countries, and it was a unique experience.
Boris Yeltsin, couple.
I was about to say,
he must have been on his best behavior, Marty, because
it looks like water.
Yeah, exactly. He seemed all right to me.
He seemed okay. Yeah,
he seemed all right to me.
Redness in the face.
No, okay. Well, there was redness, but I think it was probably all right
there.
It's
probably
just but no, it was it was an experience, and I even kept a log diary, several diaries that I have in the attic in my house, and someday I'll dust them off and read through them and bore my kids with stories. But
you are very young, only
34.
34 years old.
You're a pup.
Now, how did you get so connected to the White House?
It was, we talked about this prior to the show starting. I'd gone to school in Washington, D.C., as did you, to college. And when I was there, I sort of developed an interest in politics. I wasn't a political science major. I was a history and English major in school. But I volunteered a lot of my time interning, different jobs in Washington, on Capitol Hill. Actually volunteered on the ill-fated 1992 re-election of my future boss. And he always teased me and said, if you'd done your job better, I wouldn't have had to hire you. And it was through that experience that I had the chance to meet a lot of people. And one of the people that I met was tied into the former president in a consulting capacity. And so when the job that I ended up applying for and ultimately getting became available, he called me. I was living in Stamford, actually, Connecticut at the time, and said to me, "How'd you like to interview for this job?" And after I realized he wasn't joking, I said, "Sure, I'd love to." And that's how it happened. So they say in life, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and I don't quite know if that's true, but in my case, so far that has been the case. So
good. What we're gonna do? We're gonna take a break. We're going to go to the news. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about your new job.
My new job.
In Connecticut.
Uh-oh. Okay.
Okay?
Great.
So what we're going to do is take a break. And we have, please call in. The phone number is 792-4101 when we come back. Okay, we'll be right back.